Get on the ground now. Move!
Congresswoman!
Yep.
I am a U.S. Congresswoman. You cannot do this!
Hands behind your back. Do it now!
On a quiet suburban driveway, just after sunrise, masked federal agents surrounded a sitting member of Congress without presenting a warrant. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. A woman who had spent years writing federal law now found herself demanding to see the legal authority behind the men closing in on her property. They refused. Within minutes, the encounter escalated from a tense exchange to a physical detention attempt, carried out in full view of her family home. What the agents did not account for was the small black dome mounted above the garage. The home security system recorded every word, every movement, every refusal to identify themselves, and every procedural shortcut taken in real time. By the end of that morning, the footage would not only contradict the official report, it would trigger internal investigations, public scrutiny, and legal consequences that extended far beyond that driveway. This was not a dispute over politics. It was a confrontation over constitutional limits, federal power, and the assumption that authority alone was enough. The camera did not argue. It simply documented, and what it captured would ultimately cost careers, reputations, and trust. Masked federal agents stood in a suburban driveway, surrounding a woman who had spent years helping write the nation's laws. Their vehicles were unmarked. Their faces were covered. No warrant was visible in their hands. The woman they encircled was still in her morning clothes, holding a phone at her side, asking for proof that they had the right to be there. Above the garage door, a small security camera recorded everything without pause. Just minutes earlier, the street had been quiet. It was a weekday morning in a middle-class neighborhood with trimmed lawns and school buses scheduled to arrive within the hour. The Congresswoman had been preparing for a routine day. She planned to review briefing documents at home before driving to a district meeting. Her staff expected her on a conference call later that morning. Inside the house, a family member moved between the kitchen and living room, unaware of what was about to unfold outside. Neighbors would later say they noticed the SUVs first. They arrived quickly and parked along the curb and partially in the driveway. Several men stepped out wearing tactical vests marked with federal insignia. Their faces were concealed by masks. None approached the front door. Instead, they moved directly toward the driveway as the garage door began to open. And when the Congresswoman stepped outside, she appeared confused but composed. She asked the agents to identify themselves. They stated they were with immigration enforcement. She asked to see a warrant signed by a judge. Under normal circumstances, an arrest at a private home requires a judicial warrant unless there is an emergency. No emergency was visible. There was no pursuit, no immediate threat, no attempt to flee. The agents did not produce paperwork. They repeated their demand for her to comply. She stood near her vehicle, holding her ground, asking again for documentation. The exchange remained tense but controlled. Across the street, a neighbor stepped onto his lawn, watching. A second neighbor recorded from a phone near her front window. As the seconds passed, the agents closed the distance. One reached toward her arm, or another positioned himself behind her. The camera above the garage captured the shift in body language, the tightening circle, the first physical contact. What had begun as a request for documentation was turning into a detention attempt in full public view. The agents' claim rested on federal authority. They identified themselves as officers assigned to immigration enforcement. In the United States, federal agents can make arrests under certain conditions. But when an arrest is attempted at a private home, the Constitution usually requires a warrant signed by a judge. A warrant is a written order that shows a court has reviewed evidence and approved the action. It protects citizens from sudden and unjustified seizures. Standing in her own driveway, the Congresswoman asked again to see that document. She was not resisting. She was not attempting to leave. She was asking for proof that the agents had followed the law. Her background as a legislator meant she understood the difference between authority and lawful authority. Federal power must be supported by procedure. Without paperwork, the foundation weakens. The agents did not present a warrant. One officer kept his hands near his vest. Another repeated instructions for her to step forward. Their tone remained firm. From the security camera's angle, their badges were partially visible, but their faces were covered. The recording captured clear audio. Each request for documentation could be heard. Each refusal was preserved with a timestamp. Across the street, two neighbors had now gathered on the sidewalk. A third person stood at the end of a driveway holding a phone, and the presence of witnesses changed the atmosphere. What might have been a quiet confrontation became a public scene. Children waiting for a school bus looked toward the flashing lights of the parked vehicles. The Congresswoman's family member opened the front door, remaining just inside the frame. Under standard enforcement practice, officers are trained to announce their purpose and present required documents when entering private property for an arrest. Exceptions exist when there is immediate danger or risk of escape. In this situation, no such urgency was visible. The Congresswoman was stationary. Her vehicle was off. There was no sign of violence. The agents insisted that their verbal identification was enough. She continued to request written authorization. The distance between them narrowed. One agent stepped closer, extending a hand toward her elbow. The camera captured her slight movement backward, not as an attempt to flee, but as a natural reaction to unexpected contact. The conflict was no longer about identity. It was about paper, process, and the limits of power. With no warrant shown, the agents moved forward anyway. The security camera recorded each second, silent and impartial, as procedure gave way to force. The moment physical contact began, the tone of the encounter changed. One agent took hold of the Congresswoman's arm. Another moved behind her, positioning himself to control her other side. The security camera above the garage captured the shift clearly. Her posture remained upright. Her hands were visible. She did not swing or strike. She appeared startled, turning her head toward the agent who first grabbed her. From inside the house, a family member stepped onto the front porch. The door remained open behind them. The camera audio recorded raised voices, not shouting, but firm commands layered over repeated requests for documentation. The Congresswoman's words were steady. She continued asking to see a warrant. The agents repeated instructions to comply. Across the street, neighbors had stopped pretending not to watch. Two stood near the curb. One continued recording on a phone. Another walked closer but stayed on the sidewalk. The presence of witnesses added pressure. The agents worked quickly, guiding the Congresswoman toward one of the SUVs parked along the driveway. One officer attempted to turn her around to place her hands behind her back. She stiffened slightly, not in aggression, but in confusion and disbelief. Her movements were measured. The camera angle showed no attempt to run. Her car door remained open behind her. Papers lay on the passenger seat, untouched. An agent positioned near the vehicle opened the rear door. The interior was dark. Another officer maintained his grip on her arm. The security footage recorded the agents speaking over one another, giving short commands. The Congresswoman's face, partially visible in profile, showed strain but not panic. She appeared focused on maintaining balance as her arms were guided downward. Inside the house, the family member stepped farther onto the porch, hands visible, watching closely. A neighbor called out from across the street, though the words were unclear on the recording. The school bus approached the corner, slowing as children and parents looked toward the scene. Within minutes, the agents had placed the Congresswoman near the open vehicle door. Her wrists were held together, though no handcuffs were yet visible on camera. The detention attempt had moved from verbal dispute to physical restraint. Every movement, every placement of hands, and every second without a warrant on display was captured by the fixed lens above the garage. Later that morning, after the vehicles left and the street returned to its usual rhythm, the security system continued recording. The camera above the garage had stored high-definition video with synchronized audio. The footage was automatically backed up to a secure cloud server. Nothing had been erased. Nothing had been edited. By midday, the Congresswoman's legal team arrived at the home. They requested immediate access to the recording system. A technician downloaded the files directly from the device and verified the timestamps. The chain of custody was documented from the start. That means every person who handled the footage was recorded, creating a clear record that the video had not been altered. The first viewing took place in a quiet living room. Attorneys watched the encounter from beginning to end without interruption. They paused at key moments. The footage showed the arrival of unmarked vehicles. It showed masked agents approaching without knocking. It captured repeated requests for a warrant. At no point did an officer display written authorization to enter the property or make an arrest. The audio was clear. Each statement could be heard distinctly. The agents identified themselves verbally, but did not provide badge numbers when first asked. The Congresswoman's tone remained controlled. She did not threaten. She did not attempt to strike or flee. The video documented her standing position, her visible hands, and the physical contact initiated by officers. Later, the official report filed by the agents would describe the situation differently. It characterized the Congresswoman as obstructive and non-compliant. The report suggested urgency. The video did not show urgency. It showed a woman in her driveway asking for documentation. Attorneys reviewed the footage frame by frame. They examined body positioning, distance, and timing. They noted the absence of visible danger. They marked the exact second when the first agent made physical contact. They compared that timestamp to the written report. The footage was preserved in multiple formats and stored in secure locations. Copies were prepared for potential oversight review. The small camera above the garage had not moved. It had no opinion. It simply recorded what happened. And what it recorded created a detailed, objective account that could not be dismissed as memory or interpretation. Within 48 hours, selected portions of the security footage were submitted to federal oversight officials. The Congresswoman's legal team first provided the full, unedited recording to the agency's internal review division. Shortly after, copies were delivered to the department's Inspector General, an independent office responsible for investigating misconduct. The release was controlled and deliberate. Nothing was posted publicly at first. The goal was documentation, not publicity. News of the incident spread before the video did. Reporters learned that a sitting member of Congress had been detained outside her home by immigration agents. Initial statements from the agency described the encounter as a lawful enforcement action involving temporary detention. The language was brief and procedural. It did not mention the absence of a warrant. When portions of the footage were later confirmed by oversight officials, major news networks began requesting access. After consultation, the Congresswoman authorized the release of a short segment that showed her repeated requests for documentation and the agent's refusal to provide it. The clip was time-stamped and unedited. It showed the arrival of masked officers and the moment physical contact began. Legal analysts reviewed the footage on air. Former federal prosecutors explained that, under normal circumstances, entry onto private residential property for arrest requires a judicial warrant, unless there is clear emergency risk. Constitutional scholars noted that verbal identification alone does not replace written authorization. The debate focused on process, not politics. Public reaction was immediate, but measured. Civil liberties organizations called for transparency. Some federal officials urged patience while the internal review proceeded. The presence of clear video limited speculation. Viewers could see the sequence themselves. The visual record reduced reliance on conflicting statements. Within days, the agency announced a formal internal investigation. The agents involved were reassigned pending review. Congressional oversight committees requested briefings. The situation had moved beyond a neighborhood dispute. It had become a national question about limits of enforcement authority and the role of documented evidence in holding that authority accountable. The formal investigation began quietly. The agency's Office of Professional Responsibility opened a case file and secured all body camera footage from the agents involved. Their written reports were collected and preserved. Supervisors were instructed not to discuss the matter publicly while the review was underway. The agents were placed on administrative leave, meaning they were removed from field duty, but continued receiving pay until findings were reached. Investigators first compared the driveway security footage with the agent's body camera recordings. They aligned timestamps to ensure accuracy. Body cameras are required during most enforcement actions, and the data is stored on secure servers. The review team examined when the cameras were activated and whether any gaps existed. They also reviewed dispatch logs to determine what information had been relayed before arrival. The written reports described the Congresswoman as delaying and interfering with lawful duties. They suggested that officers believed she might retreat into the home. The security video showed her standing near her vehicle, not moving toward the front door. Investigators noted the difference. They documented each inconsistency In a formal memorandum, supervisors interviewed the agents separately. Standard procedure requires officers to explain their actions, and the basis for believing a warrant exception applied. Investigators asked whether there was evidence of immediate danger or risk of flight, so they asked why no written authorization was presented. The answers were recorded and added to the case file. At the same time, the Inspector General's office reviewed policy manuals. Federal enforcement guidelines outline when agents may conduct warrantless arrests. Those exceptions are narrow. They typically involve urgent threats or active pursuit. The driveway situation did not appear to meet those criteria. As the review progressed, internal emails surfaced discussing operational pressure to act quickly on certain enforcement targets. Investigators assessed whether that pressure influenced judgment. The focus remained procedural. The question was not political identity. It was whether agency rules and constitutional standards had been followed. Weeks later, the agents remained on leave. Their badges and credentials were temporarily suspended. The investigation had moved from preliminary review to potential disciplinary findings. Careers now depended on what the evidence would ultimately confirm. Months after the incident, the internal investigation reached its conclusion. The agency released a formal summary of findings. Investigators determined that the agents had failed to follow established protocol for residential arrest procedures. They had not obtained a judicial warrant. They had not documented a qualifying emergency that would allow bypassing one. The report also found that portions of their written accounts did not accurately reflect the sequence captured on video. As a result, 2 primary agents involved in the physical detention were terminated from federal service. A third received a lengthy suspension and mandatory retraining for supervisory failures. Termination meant immediate loss of employment, federal credentials, and eligibility for certain retirement benefits tied to years of service. The agency emphasized that the decision was based on procedural violations and reporting inconsistencies, not political identity of the subject. Shortly after the disciplinary actions, the civil case moved toward resolution. Mediation sessions were held under court supervision. Both sides reviewed the strength of the evidence. The security footage remained central. It clearly showed the absence of a warrant presentation and the initiation of physical restraint without visible emergency conditions. A settlement was reached before trial. The federal government agreed to pay a financial sum reported to be in the mid-6-figure range. The payment covered legal costs and compensation for unlawful detention and reputational harm. Settlements of this type do not always include admission of wrongdoing, but they reflect recognition of legal risk and evidentiary strength. In addition to financial compensation, the agency announced mandatory retraining for regional enforcement teams. Updated guidance clarified warrant requirements, identification procedures, and documentation standards for residential operations. Supervisors were instructed to reinforce constitutional compliance during all field briefings. The outcome carried weight beyond the individuals involved. Careers ended. Public records documented the violations. Policy directives were rewritten. The small camera above the garage had provided a fixed, impartial account that shaped each decision. Accountability did not arrive through rhetoric. It arrived through documented evidence that could be examined, paused, and reviewed without distortion. The consequences did not end with terminations and settlement. Congressional oversight committees opened formal hearings to examine broader enforcement practices. Lawmakers requested internal training manuals, arrest statistics, and documentation policies related to residential operations. Senior agency officials testified under oath about warrant procedures and supervisory review standards. During these hearings, the driveway footage was referenced repeatedly as a case study, not for political effect, but as an example of procedural breakdown. Members of both parties focused on clarity of rules. They examined how officers are trained to distinguish between public arrests and entry onto private residential property. The distinction matters because homes receive the highest level of constitutional protection. Policy analysts within the agency conducted a nationwide audit of similar operations. They reviewed past cases to determine whether documentation had been consistently obtained and properly presented. The audit identified gaps in training related to warrant exceptions. Some field offices relied too heavily on verbal authorization from supervisors, rather than confirm judicial approval. As a result, the agency issued revised national guidance. The updated policy required digital verification of signed warrants before any residential arrest could proceed, except in clearly documented emergencies. Body camera activation was mandated before agents exited their vehicles. Supervisors were required to confirm compliance in writing within hours of each operation. Training programs were expanded. Scenario-based exercises now included review of constitutional limits and the importance of clear identification. Agents were instructed to display credentials and provide documentation when requested, unless safety made it impossible. The goal was not only discipline, but prevention. Civil liberties organizations monitored the reforms closely. Independent observers were invited to review portions of the updated curriculum. Transparency reports were published, outlining compliance rates and corrective actions. The driveway incident became a reference point within policy discussions. It demonstrated how a single documented event could trigger institutional reassessment. The focus shifted from individual failure to structural improvement. Systems were adjusted so that authority would be exercised within clear, visible boundaries, supported by written approval and recorded accountability. In the months that followed, the driveway returned to its quiet routine. The vehicles were gone. The news trucks no longer lined the curb. School buses stopped at the corner as they always had. From the outside, the neighborhood looked unchanged, but the impact of that morning remained. For the Congresswoman and her family, daily life required adjustment. Security assessments were conducted. Travel schedules were reviewed more carefully. Though she returned to work, the experience altered simple routines. Walking to her car now carried a heightened awareness. The knowledge that federal agents had attempted to detain her without presenting a warrant did not fade easily. Emotional strain was addressed privately. Away from cameras, the agents who lost their positions faced a different aftermath. Termination from federal service closed doors to future law enforcement employment. Public records of disciplinary findings followed their names. Years of career advancement ended with a single documented incident. The consequences were professional and permanent. Public trust in enforcement institutions also absorbed the event. Surveys conducted months later showed increased concern about warrant procedures and transparency. At the same time, the agency's policy reforms were cited as evidence that oversight mechanisms could function when evidence was clear. Accountability, while delayed, had materialized through established legal channels. The security camera above the garage remained in place. It had not been installed for political reasons. It was part of a standard home system, purchased for everyday protection. Yet, its neutral recording shaped a national discussion about constitutional limits. It demonstrated how ordinary technology can preserve truth in moments of imbalance. The case did not redefine federal authority. It reinforced existing boundaries. Written warrants, judicial review, and documented justification are not technicalities. They are safeguards designed to prevent misuse of power. On a quiet suburban driveway, those safeguards were tested. The record created that morning ensured that the test did not disappear into conflicting reports. The street settled back into normal rhythm. Law enforcement agencies adjusted policy. Courts recorded settlement terms. Careers changed course. What remained was a clear example of how evidence, calmly examined, can restore balance when authority moves beyond its limits.